Ever since the UK voted to leave the European Union, the Foreign Affairs Committee of EU Parliament has been making some strange noises. In fact, only a few days removed from the actual vote, they seem to be calling on the EU to form its own military force. Now, here's the statement made by Elmar Brok to the German magazine Die Welt. We need more cooperation in the European defense policy. We need a common military headquarters and a coalition of EU countries acting in accordance with the permanent structural cooperation of the EU treaty. From such a group, an EU army could eventually emerge. Such a force would strengthen the role of Europeans in global security and defense policy, make Europe fulfill better its responsibilities in the world, and would also achieve more synergies in defense spending. Now, he did go on to mention that this is not possible at this time because there were too many restraints and restrictions. In fact, this would actually involve legislation that would alter the very rules of the EU itself in order to carry out. Now, basically, this would try to replace the European Security Strategy Policy document that was enacted in 2003. In other words, they would completely update their entire, essentially, quasi-military treaty. Now, it's obvious that all states do require some form of military presence in order to maintain itself, some kind of self-defense mechanism that basically, any state would. I mean, there's no exception in this case. Now, it would also make it much harder for your EU countries to leave the EU if they were tied by a military treaty. Now, the timing of this obviously should not be seen as a coincidence. The UK is voting to leave, and some people have suggested that this is kind of a subtle threat that has been thrown at the UK, that there will be repercussions for this kind of thing. Or maybe even trying to shame the UK to say, well, you're leaving us, you're compromising the security of the European people. Now, as much as it would seem very much possible that it was a subtle threat, I think it actually resides in something else. The EU is in itself a union of imperialist powers. Most of the military force used for European imperialism is the military of the UK. And if the UK were to suddenly leave, well, they wouldn't really be under any obligation to carry out the imperialist interests of the European Union, now would they? In other words, they'd be using their military for their own imperialist purposes. And a big part of their entire defense, their military force, comes from basically Britain's army. So if they leave, they've drastically reduced their military power. It would be left largely up to France and Germany at that point. So I think the idea here is to get one cohesive military power inside for the EU in preparation for a possible Brexit. That would make it a more sustainable for the imperialist interests of the European Union. So I don't think it can be necessarily reduced as to, this is some kind of threat. Although in this case, they did offhandedly mention Russia, and Russia is constantly a problem in the EU. For the EU, they're terribly evil and all that same old nonsense. But we can definitely see that the divides among the countries in the European Union are growing, as this vote certainly demonstrated, both inside the UK and within the European Union itself. And with the threat of such a fracture, they're resorting to more and more militarist actions in order to defend that empire. Thank you for watching. Won't you go ahead, rate, comment, subscribe, and share on various social media. And if you want, you can head over to my Patreon page and show your support. Or you could head over to the MRN bookstore and check out some of the latest books available.